Okay, great. So thank you very much. And let me add my thanks to Elena and all of the organizers of the Congress for all the hard work that I know goes into organizing these things, especially with the many challenges you've all faced because of the pandemic. So thank you for that. And also thank you for inviting me to participate in this session. Sadly, given the time difference, I won't be around for as much as I'd like, but I'm grateful to be with you now. Before I get going, there is a handout containing an outline for my talk in both English and Russian, which I believe was sent out to everyone earlier. Just in case, I'm sending it to you right now in the chat here on Zoom. So the link is there in the chat now. If you don't have it, you should be able to click on that link and get it. My topic today is scientific knowledge in the public sphere. And of course, there are a lot of ways to approach that topic. There are important questions here concerning the roles and functions of scientific knowledge in broader societal contexts. And this might lead immediately to important questions regarding the economic, political, and ethical dimensions of these roles and functions. Today, I'm going to focus on one particular piece of this, namely the public understanding of science. It's just one piece, but it's crucial because the way science is conceived in the public domain is a major determinant of all of the things I've just mentioned. Am I coming through clearly?
Yes.
Okay, I just had a notification that the connection was unstable. So if there's any trouble, you just let me know. So, as I've mentioned, the public understanding of science is crucial because the way science is conceived in the public domain is a major determinant of all of the things that I just mentioned. That is to say, the public understanding of science is a major factor in determining what roles and functions societies will allow for scientific knowledge, largely by means of determining how scientific knowledge is viewed in relation to economic, political, and ethical interests and concerns. I'm going to take one thing for granted as an assumption here at the start. In keeping with the theme of this Congress, I'm going to assume that one of the things we want the sciences to do, this may even be the most important thing for the sciences to do, is to serve the common good. That is, produce knowledge that can be acted upon to promote our collective and planetary welfare. So with that assumption in mind, there's a lot at stake in the public understanding of science. If we want the sciences to serve those ends, then public understanding has to be such that it supports acting on our best science to promote them. For instance, by making public policy and governing accordingly. So here's what I'm going to do today, right? Next, I'll attempt to refine the idea of public understanding by considering what, in the philosophy of science, people refer to as the phenomenon of knowledge transfer. That is, transposing knowledge from one domain into another domain. Then, I'll consider some of the ways in which transferring knowledge from scientific contexts into public ones inevitably faces certain challenges. And finally, I'll argue that in order to overcome these challenges, what we really need to do is to think about the public understanding of science in a very different way. Not so much as concerning the content of scientific theories and models, but rather in terms of understanding the nature of scientific knowledge. And finally, though I won't have a lot of time to do this, a suggestive sketch of what this means by describing briefly an account of what sorts of reflections on the nature of scientific knowledge would, in fact, result in more effective uptake of it in the public domain for the common good. Okay then, how do we think about the public understanding of science? Well, as I've just mentioned, I'd like to approach this question by first thinking about the general phenomenon of attempting to extract knowledge from one domain and then transferring it effectively into a different domain. Let's follow a number of philosophers of science here and call this knowledge transfer. Although I think this idea has earlier antecedents, over the past decade, a number of philosophers have become especially interested in how scientific theorizing or modeling in one context of science sometimes ends up being incredibly useful and effective in different contexts. So, for example, there have been fascinating studies of how models developed, say, in game theory, ultimately found their way into biology, or how modeling in physics found its way into economics, and so on. If you haven't come across this before, I highly recommend a special issue of the journal Studies in History and Philosophy of Science that was published last year. It cuts across many issues in the methodology and epistemology of the sciences. Now, with the public understanding of science in mind, what I want to do here is generalize or extend this notion of knowledge transfer in a different direction. I'm interested here not so much in the notion of transferring knowledge between contexts of scientific practice, which involves applying a model or some other scientific content to more than one target system in the world. What I'm interested in here, primarily, isn't this sort of transferring of knowledge between scientific contexts, but rather transferring knowledge between scientific contexts on the one hand and broader or societal contexts on the other. There are some illuminating analogies and disanalogies, I think, between how knowledge is transferred between strictly scientific contexts and how it's transferred beyond scientific contexts into the broader public domain. Let me just point out a couple of them here today, which are important, I think, to understanding how we should view the public understanding of science. Here's what happens in knowledge transfer between scientific contexts. When we move from one context to another, the subject matter, the systems under consideration, are different. But there's something about them that's the same, right? There's an analogy or similarity between them that allows for knowledge transfer. Often what's shared is a formal or structural similarity, right? So by structure here, I mean some set of relations between parameters. It may be mathematical, computational, causal, what have you. The important point is that in many cases, even though the semantics or the interpretation of that structure varies between contexts, that's how you get, for example, one and the same model being useful in, say, physics and economics, something epistemically virtuous, namely knowledge transfer, occurs despite the difference in semantic content in virtue of the invariance of the relevant structure. So when there is, in fact, this sort of synergy between two contexts, knowledge transfer is successful. Now, the idea of there being something shared across scientific contexts is analogous to the notion of knowledge transfer from scientific contexts to societal ones. Typically, what's shared is supposed to be some sort of factual description, right? A claim, a view, a theoretical assertion, a prediction, a retrodiction, an explanation. But here, disanalogous to the case of transfers between scientific contexts, different interpretations across science to society transfers are often epistemically problematic. The reason for this is that often public contexts don't or simply can't produce interpretations of the shared content that allows for a successful transfer. There are, I think, insuperable problems involved in transferring scientific knowledge to the public, at least insofar as this knowledge is typically conceived narrowly in terms of factual descriptions of target systems. Okay, I know that all sounds very abstract, right? So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to unpack what I've just said in more concrete terms. I'm going to try to explain why I think our current conception of the public understanding of science makes successful knowledge transfer from the sciences effectively impossible. And then I'll hint at what a more successful conception would look like. Now, before doing that, please indulge me for a very brief aside, right? I want to clear the ground a little by setting aside something that is very commonly discussed in the literature on science in the public sphere. And that's what I've called on the handout, a non-epistemic failure to transfer knowledge. A lot of excellent history, philosophy, and sociology of science has documented the many ways in which science is sometimes corrupted at the source, right, via phenomena like the thunder effect, or ways in which genuine knowledge is simply presented by people with economic or political or ideological interests that are at odds with our best science. So, for example, subverted science in the form of funding effects by tobacco or pharmaceutical companies, or the misrepresentations of research by people in the anti-vaccination movement or climate change denialists. Sometimes they emphasize statistically marginal, otherwise outlier interpretations. These are non-epistemic failures to transfer knowledge simply because there's no genuine attempt here to transfer knowledge at all, right? Of course, that isn't to say it's important. On the contrary, it's extremely important. All I'm saying is that these attempts to undermine science aren't the kind of difficulty that I'm zeroing in on today. So I won't be focusing on those challenges in particular. A similar sort of caveat applies to cases of pseudoscience, whose practitioners may be trying consciously to undermine science, though certainly in the course of advocating pseudoscience, they may in fact undermine science. Pseudoscience doesn't produce scientific knowledge, so there's no question here of knowledge transfer as such. So I'll leave that aside as well. Okay. Having identified what I won't be focusing on, let me turn back now to what I do want to focus on, namely the idea that public domains of interpretation don't generally allow interpretations of putatively factual descriptions of target systems in the world in ways that amount to successful instances of knowledge transfer. The reason for this is something that I mentioned earlier when describing the basic idea of knowledge transfer. Scientific claims are embedded in a larger and richer interpretive context. That larger interpretive context doesn't mesh very well, doesn't fit very well with whatever it is that you're attempting to transfer from one place to another. The transfer is bound to fail. So here's an example of this. It's what I call translational challenges. Obviously, scientists engaged in a particular area of research have some significant understanding of the descriptive content of that research. Historians and philosophers of science commonly have a significant understanding of the descriptive content of the science that they consider in depth. Now, what happens when scientists or historians or philosophers speak in the public sphere about scientific knowledge? Translational challenges are ones of determining how to describe the content of science in a way that's accessible to scientific audiences. A description that does justice to the details is often simply inaccessible, but simplified descriptions are often simply false. Even with the best will in the world, it's often very difficult and sometimes impossible to strike a successful balance here, right, between simplifying, right, and oversimplifying so that what you're saying is just false. For example, in hopes of making things accessible, we sometimes transfer highly abstract or idealized descriptions of scientific work into public contexts. But these descriptions are strictly speaking false, and in some cases, this even plays right into the hands of people who are seeking to undermine science, the sorts of people I had a moment ago. And then the translation fails. So here's a very basic illustration of this. In secondary school, in many parts of the world, we teach that there's a uniquely epistemically privileged procedure for investigating the world, the scientific method. It's privileged in the sense that when it comes to target systems of interest in the world, the scientific method is like a recipe for generating truths. Now, as we know, the very idea of a method is an abstraction from some very particular forms of scientific research, especially those found in highly experimental disciplines. But there are lots of different forms of scientific investigation, and not all of them fit that precise mold very well. There is no one method. If you look at the amazing variety of practices that now fall under the heading of the sciences, from, say, investigating animal behavior to modeling quantum gravity, there just isn't a recipe that amounts to a common methodology, unless perhaps you describe it so generally or abstractly that it becomes effectively empty. Now, this is a specialized audience, so I don't really need to go on at length about this. From Newton's idea of deduction from the phenomena to what looks to me like the best explanation in Darwin, to Einstein's thought experiments, to Aleister Crombie's styles of knowing, or Ian Hacking's styles of reasoning. Right? You get the idea. There are a lot of different things here. The translation of the complexity of scientific methods into a highly abstract, inspiring idea of the scientific method fails in part because, as a description of what it takes to be genuinely scientific, it's false. And one consequence of this is that it makes some scientific knowledge vulnerable to the promotion of science skepticism. It makes it too easy to point at parts of science that aren't well described by it and say, you know, look, this doesn't even match what every secondary school student knows about science. That's a very simple example of what I nevertheless take to be a serious class of challenges to science to society knowledge transfer. Translational challenges. Here's a second class. What's the epistemic upshot of our best science? The answer to that question is contested by historians and philosophers of science. For example, as you know, there's an impressive array of forms of scientific realism and anti-realism that have been articulated. Collectively, they represent a number of disagreements about how to answer that question about what is the epistemic upshot of the sciences. As an aside, I should be clear that this isn't merely a disagreement among philosophers. If I had more time, I'd contend in more detail that these same sorts of disagreements appear between scientists, even if they may express them differently and don't pursue them to the same great lengths as historians and philosophers of science do. And that's because, as I argued in a recent book, any interpretation of scientific theories and models turns on issues that are ultimately what we would recognize as philosophical issues, concerning factors that are relevant to assessing our warrant for belief. But I won't say more about that today. If you're interested, the book is called Scientific Ontology, and the paperback came out earlier this year. So let me call this second class of impediments to science to society knowledge transfer interpretational challenges. Here's a way of describing the particular example of the interpretational challenge I just hinted at, posed by different approaches to understanding the epistemic upshot of science, given by different forms of scientific realism and anti-realism. You might think of the challenge here in terms of a broad distinction between instrumentalism on the one hand and appeals to approximate truth on the other. Instrumentalism, of course, is the idea that the sciences are tools for doing things, right? Manipulating, intervening, changing states of affairs, tackling problems, producing desired outcomes, and so on. Right? That's the kernel of a lot of overlap in the traditions of empiricist and pragmatist and Kuhnian philosophy of science. It's compatible with and can be supplemented by many more specific and detailed theses about, say, the semantics of scientific terms, the aims of science, and more. But in the sense I'm using it here, the core of instrumentalism is neutral with respect to these more fine-grained claims. Stripped down to its core in this way, instrumentalism is inherently quietist about many epistemic questions. It's concerned with what works. On the other hand, approaches to interpretation that emphasize approximate truths go further. They want to explain why our best science is so instrumentally effective in terms of the truth and the reference of certain underlying descriptions, all of which these people take to be supported by our evidence. Now, as you know, there's no consensus regarding how we should interpret our best science. And there's no consensus on how to answer the question regarding what the epistemic upshot of science is, not among philosophers of science, and sometimes not even among scientists. This poses, I think, serious challenges for science to society knowledge transfer, what I'm calling interpretational challenges. Okay, just to give you a quick sense of at least one example of how these challenges, translational and interpretational challenges, can arise in practice, let me give you a very little bit about some work I've been doing recently on the nature of scientific disagreement and consensus. Earlier, I mentioned that, sadly, as we know, a number of special interest groups have been very effective at misrepresenting science in the public domain. This is sometimes facilitated, I think, by widespread misunderstandings of the highly variable nature of scientific disagreement. It's one thing to point out that even if there are outliers in a given area of research, high degrees of scientific consensus can and should be taken seriously by non-experts when they're trying to decide what they should believe. But there are also cases of disagreements that don't take the form of a high degree of consensus on one hand and a few outlier views on the other. In a paper I'm working on currently, I argue that there are different forms of scientific disagreement along a spectrum corresponding to what I call relatively unsettled science and relatively settled science. In cases of relatively unsettled science, disagreement most commonly takes the form of disputes about directions of science and the methods of research, though occasionally they involve reputational issues as well. What's crucial about disagreement in cases of relatively unsettled science is that it tends to be relatively transient, right? Temporary, because the science itself is relatively unsettled. Conversely, in cases of relatively settled science, while there may be developments in directions and methodologies, the primary focus of disagreement concerns the correct interpretation of the science at issue. And here, I argue, disagreement tends not to be transient at all, but relatively stable. Perhaps you can see, even on the basis of this incredibly brief description I've given of a sort of rubric for thinking about scientific disagreement, perhaps you can see how interpretational challenges will naturally occur and inevitably arise in connection with knowledge transfer from scientific to societal contexts. There's easily a lot of misunderstanding here, I think, about the nature of different sorts of disagreement. In cases of relatively stable disagreements about the interpretation of relatively settled science, it isn't really possible to say, as we do in cases of relatively unsettled science, that the disagreement is temporary, that we can expect it to be resolved as science settles. We can't say that because we're talking about relatively settled science and stable disagreements. Now, of course, there's obviously much more to be said about this, but I can't really do it justice today. So please just extract from this very quick example of different sorts of scientific disagreement the idea that there are, I think, principled reasons to expect that interpretational science to society knowledge transfer are likely to occur. Okay. Let me conclude in this last part of my talk with what I take to be the moral of all of this discussion of transferring knowledge from scientific contexts into the public domain for the conception of the public understanding of science, and more specifically, for the sort of public understanding that would, ideally, support the use of science in pursuit of the common good. One thing that's common to all cases of knowledge transfer, which I've alluded to several times now in passing, is what we might call semantic embedding. The idea is that in order for there to be successful transfer, we need to take a description of something that functions well in one context and transfer it into another context in which it also functions well. When I say a description functions well, what I mean is that it's embedded in a semantic context of interpretation in which it helps us to achieve whatever goals we have in that context. So for example, the Lotka-Volterra model, which is essentially just a pair of coupled nonlinear differential equations, can be used to describe fluctuations in predator-prey population levels. That is to say, it can be interpreted in the context of ecology so as to serve that purpose. But the very same model can also be used to describe economic fluctuations in employment rates and the share of labor in national income. That is, it can be interpreted in the context of economics to serve that very different purpose. The Lotka-Volterra model as a description can be embedded highly successfully in these very different contexts of interpretation. That's what I mean by the notion of semantic embedding. Successful semantic embedding is what underwrites successful knowledge transfer. Now, as we've seen, when it comes to transferring knowledge from the sciences to the public domain, there are serious challenges, what I've called translational and interpretational challenges. The most common response to worries like this, you see this a lot, for example, in the education literature, is to champion educational reform in order to achieve greater scientific literacy in the public. In other words, this is that if we could only ensure that the general public knows more about science, we'd be able to dissolve the challenges of knowledge transfer. Why? Well, because the general public would have a more sophisticated understanding of scientific theories and models, which would then reduce the degrees to which these things need to be translated and interpreted. But this educationally utopian world, right? Here, the public, in virtue of having greater scientific literacy, would be able to embed the outputs of scientific work in an interpretive framework that's sufficiently similar to that of scientists to allow them to understand many or most of the relevant nuances of translation and interpretation that would then support things like sensible public policy and governance. Now, of course, that's a noble suggestion. And as a philosopher of science, I'd love for there to be more widespread scientific education. But if this is what we mean by scientific literacy and by the public understanding of science, the very idea of successful knowledge transfer is bound to fail. For one thing, it's impracticable. We don't live in a world where it's possible to ensure that a majority of citizens acquire a detailed knowledge of the nuances of contemporary science. That would require a vast amount of specialized dedication over long durations of time for everyone. More importantly, even if we do this impracticable thing, the utopian view is confused because the sciences don't stand still. Whatever content non-specialists learn today will evolve over time so that later on, whatever they've learned will be outdated. If we want the challenges of knowledge transfer I've discussed today, if we want to meet them or overcome them, we need to think about the public understanding of science in a different way, not in terms of understanding the content of specific theories and models, but rather in terms of understanding the nature of science as a set of practices that are designed for and highly successful at delivering empirical success. In other words, what's crucial to the public understanding of science is not, in the first instance, knowing a lot of science, but rather understanding that science itself is a highly effective machine for generating answers to questions and solutions to problems concerning the natural and social world. When the logical empiricists undertook to establish the sciences as the exemplary means by which to produce knowledge, it wasn't just for its own sake, but because they took properly scientific knowledge to be a basis for engaging in and bringing about social and moral progress. At the same time, when the pragmatists advocated for the notion that concepts like truth and knowledge must be understood as having a pragmatic dimension, that what it is for a claim to be meaningful at all must be understood in part on the basis of what we can do with it. They were articulating how the sciences are tied to practical consequences in human experience. Now, views like empiricism and pragmatism are often associated with the scientific anti-realist side of debates between realists and anti-realists. But I think that obscures something that's absolutely key to a proper conception of the public understanding of science. So let me just end with that. As I mentioned earlier, all of these epistemologies of science endorse the view that the sciences embody the best techniques we've been able to develop for manipulating, intervening, changing states of affairs, tackling problems, and producing desired outcomes in the world. Where they differ is in precisely how we should explain that sort of success. But this doesn't undermine the more fundamental agreement, right? It's this agreement that should be at the heart of an effective public understanding of science and the focus of general science education. So there's an important story to be told here, I think, about how, despite their differences, all of the various epistemologies of science I've just alluded to recognize the same capacity of the sciences for serving the common good and promoting our collective welfare. But I think that's all the time I have for today. So let me end, for now, on that promissory note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chakravartty, for a very clear and interesting presentation. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions? I would ask you so. As I understand, the problem of scientific knowledge transfer deals with something you call the nature of science. What do you mean by that? What is the nature of science? We used to think about science as a social constructive project. As something more than social concept. Are there any strange thing you call nature, or just a metaphor?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about the nature of science, I don't mean to suggest that science is part of nature. That's not what I mean. I just mean the character of science, what science is all about. That's all I mean. And so when I'm talking about the nature of science here, what I want to do is contrast it with the idea of thinking about the actual content of scientific theories and models. So, it's one thing to understand Newton's theory of gravitation, right? It's another thing to be able to understand Einstein's field equations in general relativity, right? These are examples of understanding the content of specific scientific theories. And what I'm trying to suggest is that our conception of the public understanding of science is too wrapped up in this idea of understanding science. Again, it's not that I think that's a bad idea. Of course, I think it would be wonderful for lots of people to understand, to learn and understand lots of science. But the point is that thinking that a large proportion of our society is going to be able to spend the time and exert the dedication to learn all of our best science is just, as I said, it's impractical, but also it doesn't serve the function that we want the public understanding of science to serve, which is that we want the public understanding of science to be something that allows the public to get behind the use of science for us to do good things, like make vaccines for COVID-19, right? And so on. So when I talk about the nature of science, I'm really talking about not the specific content of particular theories, but the idea, right, that I associated with different epistemologies of science, logical empiricism, pragmatism, and I think realist philosophies of science as well, that the sciences represent our very best techniques for systematically investigating the world, both the natural world and the social world. That isn't to say that it have the features you describe, right? Of course, they're also human creations. So they're value-laden, right? They are in some ways really constructed, right? And these are things we have to be aware of so that we can make these techniques as effective as we possibly can. And that's one of the reasons the sciences continue to evolve. But by the nature of science, I just mean understanding how and why it is that the sciences comprise a bunch of techniques that are highly successful for allowing us to solve problems.
We have another question. Please come here, both. We have only one camera.
When you were talking about interpretational models, what do you mean by these models? And is it possible to create a sort of a set of these interpretational models and use it as a sort of a metric system for translating scientific knowledge to public knowledge?
Good question. Yeah. So by interpretational challenges, I have in mind a whole class of challenges, really, that have to do with how we interpret our best science. I give an example of this. That is the way in which realists and anti-realists, for that matter, social constructivists, right, interpret the epistemic upshot of our best theories, like what that knowledge is exactly, right? They give different accounts of what that knowledge is. Now, why is this a challenge when it comes to transferring knowledge from scientific domains into the public? Well, on its face, an instrumentalist and a scientific realist and a social constructivist may give very different accounts of what scientific knowledge is. So what is it exactly that we should transfer to the public, right? If I tell a social constructivist story, that's a very different story than if I tell, a certain kind of scientific realist story, right? So these are challenges of interpretation, knowing what exactly it is that we should transfer to the public to constitute the public understanding of science. And so, part of what I was suggesting is that we are so focused, because we're philosophers and historians and scientists, we're so focused on where we disagree, right? That takes over. For us, that's our whole world. I spend all of my time arguing with people who disagree with me. But if you look at these accounts of science, they actually have something in common. There's a common element to their various interpretations, right? And that's what I'm calling this kind of instrumentalist core, the idea that we have a set of techniques that's very effective for solving problems, for learning how to change states of affairs from something that's undesirable, like a state in which we have a lot of COVID-19 infection, to a state that's more desirable, right? In which many people are vaccinated, right, against the disease. So what I'm suggesting is that interpretational challenges, like the one I mentioned, that's just one example, can be met if we do focus on what I take to be the core agreement between these different interpretations of what scientific knowledge is. And that's, right, one way, right, of resolving that interpretational challenge. I do think that there are other interpretational challenges that we face that are really not possible to overcome if we continue to think about the public understanding of science in the way I rejected. That is, to think about the public understanding of science as focused on understanding particular scientific theories and models. In part because, as we know, a lot of scientific claims are idealized, they're approximations, right? They may be abstractions. They hold in some cases, but they don't hold in other cases. So, you know, we have laws or principles that are ceteris paribus laws. They apply to certain kinds of systems, but if you change them slightly, then the law doesn't work anymore, right? All of those nuances of scientific knowledge, if you just transfer the law from the scientific context to a public context, right, there's an interpretational challenge, because generally the public doesn't have that background knowledge of what idealizations are, what approximations are, what ceteris paribus laws are, that allow them to interpret those claims properly. So that's a kind of interpretational challenge that I think simply can't be overcome if you think that the public understanding of science is all about teaching them the science, because most people are never going to learn or be able to learn the science well enough to understand all of those qualifications. You think about the public understanding of science in the way I described, right, which is to give people a better education in what is essentially, you know, some philosophy of science. Why is it that these techniques are successful in giving us solutions to problems? Then I think the public understanding of science won't be hostage to that kind of interpretational challenge.
You mean that the process of transferring is important, and it is important by itself. Right? It makes clear some characters of the nature of science. Yeah.
I think it would. I think there's a challenge for us, you know, as educators as well as researchers, to be able to make sure that we include this kind of education about the nature of science when we're teaching science. And so when I was criticizing people, I said, you know, in the literature on education, one very common thing you see that they say, well, we just need to have more scientific literacy. We need to train students better in the sciences, right? And train more people in the sciences. And I was critical of that because I said, look, you will just never be able to do that to the extent that's required in order to solve these translational and interpretational issues. But that doesn't mean that I don't think we should have educational reform. I do think we should have educational reform, but in a way that's practical, not impracticable, right? I think this teaching that I was describing very briefly at the end about just the nature of science, right? How it functions to generate solutions to problems. Right? That kind of teaching, which is something that we're very familiar with in the history and philosophy of science, is something that can be taught, right, much more easily. It doesn't require that people know a lot of mathematics. It doesn't require that people know the technical details of any one specific scientific field. It's something that can be demonstrated through some examples. What's important are not the scientific details of the example. What's important is the overall point that, oh, we have some techniques here that allow us to really probe, right, the nature of the world and to allow us to develop solutions to problems that we face. That kind of educational reform, I think, is highly practicable. And I think that's something that we need to do more of.
Thank you. We have another one question.
Anjan, thank you very much. My name is Andrei Kuznetsov. I'm from European University at St. Petersburg. So thank you for a wonderful presentation, but I'm a bit puzzled about the very term that you use, the whole presentation, the transfer of knowledge. So the image of the transfer is that we have some kind of commodity, knowledge as a commodity, okay, but then it transferred. It seems that it transferred without any transformation. And that's one point. It seems that in terms of public understanding of science, you are talking from the perspective of the deficit model, and you're talking about education. So there are enlightened scientists that they know very many things, and we need to educate the unenlightened public. And this is the one aspect of this question. And the other one is that there are a variety of knowledges that are not generated inside science. So the public itself has a variety of expertise, a variety of knowledge. So can you elaborate a little bit about these two aspects? Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. A few excellent questions there. So first of all, what is transferred exactly, right? It's true that using the term knowledge transfer is could be misleading. In the original context in which it's used, right? And that's where I was kind of borrowing the idea from, the idea of knowledge transfer within the sciences. What's transferred from one context to another is often quite minimal, right? It might be something like a mathematical structure, or I gave the example of the Lotka-Volterra model, right? It's a couple of equations that describe a model, right? That you can graph. Are we transferring knowledge? Well, we're transferring a model, right? To the extent that that model, right, describes relationships between various parameters, right? Well, we're transferring something. When we think about the application of that model in different contexts, we tend to think of the knowledge it embodies in different ways. So in the context of ecology, we think of it as a model of how populations of prey organisms and predator organisms, right, are fluctuating. In the context of economics, we think about it in a different way because the parameters are interpreted differently. So you're right to question the idea of, well, you know, is knowledge being transferred? What's being transferred? The idea is that something is being transferred, right? That's integral to or part of what counts as knowledge in these different contexts. So in the case of science to society transfers, we have things like, you know, scientific descriptions, right? A bunch of epidemiologists may say, well, it looks like this new vaccine is 95% effective. There's a claim, right? Vaccine X is 95% effective. Now we take that claim and we transfer it into the context of a public discussion of vaccines. Should people take them or not? Should I take it, right? Are my neighbors taking it, and so on. So we've transferred a claim, and now the question is, within those two contexts, is the term being interpreted the same way, right? Have there been translational simplifications of the claim in moving from the first scientific context to the second public context, and so on, right? So that's how I think of the notion of transfer here. Something is being transferred. It might be a claim, it might be a proposition, etc. But then the question is it being interpreted in a way in the public domain that allows it to do the work that scientists are hoping it would do, right? So is this reflective of the deficit model, right? That there's just a kind of lack of, you know, understanding in the public domain that needs to be rectified in order for this kind of transfer to work well. Well, yes, it is a kind of application, I suppose, of the deficit model. What I'm really trying to do is to criticize the way in which I think the deficit model has been theorized, right, in terms of a lack of scientific literacy. Because I don't think that having higher degrees of scientific literacy, for the reasons I mentioned, is really something that's practicable. And more importantly, I don't think it would work in any case, because most people are not scientific experts. They're not going to spend their whole life keeping up on all of the latest developments of the science that they may have learned in, you know, as an undergraduate at university. So there's no way of addressing the deficit if you think about public understanding in that sense. So I do want to claim that there's a kind of deficit, but it's a different kind of deficit that we need to address. It's the deficit in understanding just the nature of science in the first place, what it is, right? I mean, what kind of activity is it? And if we had a greater public understanding of the the aims and ways in which science functions generally, not in any particular case, then that I think would increase not only confidence in science, but it would also increase the kind of productive oversight of science that we want, right? Because science is value laden. So we, want to have a public that understands how science works so that they can also, right, exert some oversight over it. That answers your second question. I hope it answers a bit of your third question, which is to say that I do think that public knowledge is something that can be ameliorated in a way that would allow scientific knowledge to function, for the common good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have a time for one more question. Someone wants to ask. Everybody's tired. We should finish. I have to thank you from the organizing committee, from all the participants. Thank you very much for taking part in our meeting. For your good and clear, very interesting presentation. I hope we'll meet you again.
I hope so. And thank you very much for the invitation and also for your excellent questions. Thank you.